Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. The House of Commons reconvenes and a lot has happened between June 20th recess and today. The Liberal government tax cut for middle-income Canadians was introduced, aiming to save a two-income household as much as $800 a year. The Conservatives' opposition leader was re-elected after being parachuted into a friendly riding. And just before MPs went on break, Canada hosted the 51st G7 summit in Alberta, in which the topics of discussion included how to respond to a mercurial White House with seeming little regard for the impact that tariffs have on both sides of the border. So what should the priorities for the fall session be? For perspective, we turn to veteran political reporter Paul Wells.
They have to put Canada on a solid track to essentially triple defense or defense-related spending, find new markets, and they have to begin building very ambitious infrastructure projects in the face of environmental concerns, Indigenous communities and their preoccupations, and the sort of petty regional bean counting that is a Canadian national pastime. The task facing the Carney government is essentially impossible.
And the C.D. Howe Institute's Director of Policy Engagement, Colin Busby.
We need a fall budget that presents a clear picture for where things are at and a clear plan for the medium term that is communicable to the Canadian public and to people who purchase Canadian debt that we're on a good path. And we need some substantial progress on major infrastructure projects.
Paul and Colin, join us now. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Michael.
Hi.
The Liberals framed their middle-class tax cut as a lifeline for Canadians feeling the pinch of inflation. Paul, is $800 a year really meaningful for the average household, or is this more political theater than economic relief?
It's more meaningful the further you go down the income scale. There's a lot of people who could really use a break like that. But the bigger challenge facing the government is responding to tariffs, responding to the decline in investment that comes from those tariffs, seeking new markets elsewhere. The tax cut is very much a down payment on a lot of much harder work that still has to come.
The tax break, it's always nice to put money in people's pockets, but looking forward, what really the concerning aspect of it really is how it's going to fit into the federal government's fiscal picture. And, it's just a sort of another piece that results in a lower revenue situation for the federal government when it seems that the expenditure side of the ledger just sort of keeps increasing and increasing over and over. And, looking forward, the demands on the federal government, particularly when it comes to things like defense spending. But there are other things as well that the federal government, in particular this party, has promised to deliver, where it kind of paints this really kind of uncertain picture, and it kind of adds to this backdrop of fiscal uncertainty as we approach the fall sitting of government and actually the fall budget, where really we're going to get to better sense and a better understanding of sort of where things are at, which we don't know so far because there wasn't a spring budget.
Well, to your point, the government has spent the last 6 weeks or so in budget consultations. What does this document need to address and how?
Well, I think there's a lot of uncertainty around the fall budget. And I think there's uncertainty for a number of things. One, we don't know where we stand with respect to the revenue situation, the spending situation, not just with respect to this year, but really over the medium term. And so there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty around the whole situation. But also there's questions with respect to how the federal government plans to revise its operating versus capital expenses. So it says it's going to divide the budget up into sort of operating and capital expenses, and its commitment is to balance the operating side of the ledger. But in terms of what would actually qualify for capital expenses, we don't know. So there's all kinds of, economic uncertainty. I think there's a real backdrop of a weakening Canadian economy. I think that's concerning. And then you add into the fact that we don't know where we stand, financially, and we've got uncertainty with respect to how they're going to apply their platform commitment. And I think that that's really what we're looking for is a better picture as to how this government plans to manage things over the medium term.
And Paul, what are you hearing on Parliament Hill as far as the optimism that we're going to dot the I's and cross those T's?
The task facing the Carney government is essentially impossible. They have to put Canada on a solid track to essentially triple defense or defense-related spending over the next decade. They have to find new markets to at least partially compensate for lost business with the massive and very close American market. And they have to begin building very ambitious infrastructure projects in the face of environmental concerns, indigenous communities and their preoccupations, and the sort of petty regional bean counting that is the Canadian national pastime. We saw Premier Doug Ford say that there weren't nearly enough Ontario projects on a leaked version of the federal major projects list. That's a song that any premier can learn to sing very quickly. And if we start henpecking any list because it's possible to imagine my corner of the country getting more goodies than are provided in this list, then the whole project is doomed to an early failure. So, but apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how's the play? Like, this is going to be a very difficult budget to produce, and it's no wonder the government was at first ambivalent about whether they even wanted to produce a fall budget. The timeline for squaring all these circles is quite short.
So then, Colin, from a policy perspective, how do you weigh short-term political gains with piecemeal handing things out, or the long-term need of fiscal discipline in an era of rising interest costs on government debt?
It's the sort of squaring the circle here is also rendered a bit more complex by the fact that the federal government has committed itself to a spending review, and it's
like 1/3 of the total amount of money we spend.
So that's and I think that's the core of it, is they've really limited the spending review to such a small aspect of the overall federal spend that it draws into question sort of this medium term picture, which is really what I mean as an analyst, what I want to get a look at to get an understanding if we really are on a good path, because limiting things and more or less excluding transfers to provinces, excluding transfers to individuals from the review process for federal spending. I just see that as a too short-sighted aspect, I think, of the reviews, particularly in light of the spending obligations that are on the horizon. I mean, if they were to sort of fully complete the spending review, according to what they would like to do in terms of finding this sort of 15% savings by 2028, 2029, that in of itself still wouldn't cover the additional increases in defense spending that we're expecting over the next decade. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that it's fair to, we're going to be looking for seriousness, and we're going to be looking for seriousness in the numbers and a real credibility to it. And the challenge for them is to make that speak and to make that happen in the fall budget while balancing all their numerous commitments.
You think, Paul, they can find $22 billion by the end of 2029?
I think they certainly could. I mean, there's a lot of showcase programs from earlier that from the Trudeau government, which have not proven their effectiveness and that we could maybe do without. I expect the government will soon start to lean fairly heavily on the fact that by debt to GDP, Canada actually does work fairly well against other countries. And they'll start to say that means that we've got room to be a little bit more Italian or Japanese in our debt to GDP disposition. Different people are going to mark them more or less harshly against that. It sounds like a handy excuse. I honestly think that, the year that the United States decides that it's going to pick Canada on its list of enemies is a pretty good year to cut the government a little bit slack on the fiscal front. This is a very severe challenge that the government is facing. I think the government would do well to say, again, in stark contrast to the Trudeau government, that the first thing that comes out of their mouth is not perfect, that their first attempt at addressing these things is only a first attempt. It's a first draft, and that the announcement is not the result. The programs will be tested against results. They'll be refined over time. They'll be discarded if they're not satisfactory, and that new solutions will be tested as they come up with them. that sort of provisional and iterative approach to these challenges, I think fits the way Canadians have been living their own lives over the last half decade and would be welcomed, rather than the stupid spectacle of a government claiming to have been right the first time every time.
Let's talk about spectacle. The Conservatives re-elected their leader over the summer. Have the Conservatives learned anything from Pierre Poilievre's loss in Ottawa that they'll apply to the fall session?
Well, that's a good question. That's a question that a lot of Conservatives are asking themselves, whether their leader has learned anything. I mean, you could make a case that Pierre Poilievre was unlucky, that he faced a perfect storm. The only thing that could have gotten Trudeau out of office was a revolt from his own finance minister. The only leader who could have looked like an improvement over Trudeau was this guy Carney, and so on. And so that all Poilievre has to do is run the same play next time, and voter fatigue with the Carney Liberals will do the rest. I mean, it sounds plausible, and it may even be true. But to the extent that Carney looks like an adult compared not only to Poilievre but to Trudeau, and that Canadians prefer that kind of behavior to the sloganeering and hectoring that has characterized too much of our politics over the last decade, then that's a lesson that Poilievre seems reluctant to learn and apply. On the day that we're recording this, he put out a press release where he talked about ending the Liberal job crisis, the Liberal crime crisis, the Liberal healthcare crisis, and I don't know what else. As though the only thing happening in the world was that Mark Carney was the new prime minister. I think to a lot of Canadians that reads as a utter failure to read the room, and we'll see over time whether Poilievre is right to assume that he doesn't need to read the room more closely.
Well, Colin, read the room for us as well. What does the Institute need to see outside of verbing the noun?
There's a tremendous amount of stuff that the federal government can and arguably should do with respect to, putting the country on a better path. I mean, I think I do see some of the opportunities in Bill C5 and in the major infrastructure projects bill as, the key economic plank for this government going forward. And, really it's about unlocking it, right? It's about unlocking it. So it's about, what projects make the list and why? Is there a really good set of economic criteria surrounding that list? And is it, does it logical? Does it make sense? And then, two, it's where are we at with respect to Indigenous consultation and consultation with the provinces? Because the other aspect, of course, of this was that, the Prime Minister did say that the provinces would have, the right essentially to veto a project in progress or a project nominated, which kind of goes against a little bit of what the spirit of it is. But I think really three, which is where the rubber is going to hit the road in addition to all those other things, but it's that, what is going to be the role of, the public and private sector in these projects, or what is the potential role for the private sector in some of the infrastructure projects that, could potentially make it there. So things like transmission lines, things like, pipelines, even for that matter. Ports, I wouldn't be surprised if those are some of the sort of the early things on the list that get pushed forward because of the very, very strong case as to why the federal government should be the main, charge and funder for those projects. But with respect to pipelines, with respect to, transmission lines, what is the right role for the private sector? How do we get them involved and how do we get them on board that? And it's not only just an important policy question, but it has political weight, political emphasis too. So getting that right is one of the tricky things that we can do, or that this government essentially has to resolve. The other thing I'd say is with respect to the other big piece, and Paul outlined it, he's got the same three big pieces with me as I do, but it's the trade negotiations with the United States. So this can't really be done with, just the sort of new trade and security pact without an eye to the Canada, U.S., Mexico agreement essentially expiring next year. Like this really has to be done with a more of a medium-term perspective in the sense of how do we conclude something in this regard that paves the way for a much smoother, in fact, anticipated renewal of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement, because that's really what is, the key linchpin piece, in addition sort of Bill C-5 that I think this government has on the agenda, that it has the opportunity to, to further. But these are very complex, and, these are about as challenging an issues as it gets. Yet it is possible.
Well, then let's expand upon that by talking about the G7 specifically. The Prime Minister used that stage in Alberta to project some global leadership. We know that the last time a reality show host was in the White House, that the de facto leader of the free world was based out of Germany. What role does Canada have to play the second time around amongst the G7 when it comes to projecting a sense of leadership, but also kind of circling the wagons on the tariff issue?
I think Canadians would sometimes be surprised to learn the extent to which Canada has no basis for claiming leadership in multilateral negotiations. All of the European countries, and certainly the largest European countries, face challenges similar to ours, have more fiscal throw weight than Canada does, have been more present in international fora than Canada has. Their leaders are more welcome in the White House, and on and on and on. I think some of this is due to the fecklessness of the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau, but not all of it. A lot of it is simply geography and a sort of long complacency born of the how easy our geographic situation used to be. But the upshot is that Canada mostly has to, Canadian leaders, starting with the Prime Minister, but not only the Prime Minister, just have to show up for more of these conversations and make bigger contributions to multilateral solutions to build back a credibility that had been eroding for a long time. Canada has a lot of ground to make up on these things. This is not my own grumbling dyspeptic analysis. This is what I've heard from many European diplomats over several years.
It seems that completing the task in terms of not just meeting our NATO requirements for defense spending, which of course just rose tremendously in the last year, going from 2% of GDP to 3.5%. But I think doing so in a way that provides the Canadian military with the capabilities to be an important member of that community and our allied community, I think is really the overarching key, even more so sometimes than the exact amount of money that we spend. But are we going to be able to produce capabilities that put us in need that to our allies? The other piece I'd say too is on the trade diversification front. That's the flip side of the U.S. negotiation. That's taking on that we're taking on right now. And the trade diversification front is equally complex as the negotiations with the U.S. are, in the sense that we still have a number of deals to sign. With the UK, we don't have one. We'd like to get into ASIN, but we also have protectionist policy that are blocking us from getting into these trade deals and from completing them. Where we're having other countries walk away from the table because of our supply management sector, and they're not willing to want to negotiate these things. So in and of itself, if trade diversification is going to be the key piece that this government has raised, and frankly that a lot of people have raised as being a critical aspect of advancing and leading Canada's reliance from the U.S. in the future, we have to be able to not just negotiate these deals, but also sort of shift our supply, shift our infrastructure away to allow increased trade flows to happen. And that in and of itself is a big task.
So if you were advising the government on priorities for the session, what one policy file deserves to rise to the top of the agenda?
It's clearly going to be negotiations with the United States, and negotiations with the United States in a way that alleviates the concerns that a number of Canadian businesses have right now, and frankly, the questions that they're asking themselves, which is this the future permanent way things are going to be, this tariff world, or is this going to be a short-term, temporary thing? And they're asking themselves these questions because they're not sure where their future investments are going to go. And so that's a really critical piece for the federal government to nail that.
Paul, Parliament has a way of getting distracted by wedge issues. What's the risk that noise drowns out the signal?
It's probably lower than it usually is because the signal is so important. This is not another random 6 or 8 month period during which people can pick up their mood if they're bored by a little infighting. Canadians are watching this Parliament closely, and they will be judging the various parties by seriousness. And I have a feeling that the parties are actually quite aware of this.
So with both parties staking claims to be the champion of the middle class, how should Canadians judge which policies truly move the needle?
Canadians will judge the different parties by their various lights, as they did in the last election. I mean, last election was a near tie by popular vote. And so despite a big boost in the Conservative vote, the Liberal vote matched it. We're now 3 or 4 elections deep in near ties by popular vote. And I wouldn't presume that Canadians are going to affect a new unanimity in how they view these things. They're going to stay divided.
We need a fall budget that presents a clear picture for where things are at and a clear plan for the medium term that is communicable to the Canadian public and to people who purchase Canadian debt that we're on a good path. And we need some substantial progress on, major infrastructure projects. We need to know, where we're going to build and how and why, and really advance those as the sort of cornerstone pieces of what this government intends to do.
Gentlemen, as always, great getting your insight. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Paul Wells is a veteran political reporter whose work can be read at paulwells.substack.com. Colin Busby is the Institute's Director of Policy Engagement. For further insight into the way forward, visit cdhow.org. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thank you for joining us.